Hey everybody. This is going to be a video that will, in a way, explain some of the content in Chapter 4 of the Posterior Analytics, but I'm not going to stick that close to the text. The text in Chapter 4 is particularly difficult to understand. Good job on you if you can understand it. I'm going to focus especially on the big picture, not so much the particular arguments Aristotle makes. There's actually a fair bit of scholarly agreement that some of the arguments Aristotle actually makes in this passage aren't that good. But he is getting at an extremely important, extremely significant issue. And this is one of the few places, the topic I'm about to talk about, where Aristotle seemed to be aware of a set of philosophical issues and philosophical problems that it's not clear Plato was aware of. And this all has to do with the idea of, oops, I don't know why that's coming up. This all has to do with the idea of necessity. Now, what Aristotle says in Chapter 4 of the Posterior Analytics is that the fundamental premises of a demonstration are all necessary, and the conclusions of a demonstration are all necessary. What he says is to have scientific knowledge or understanding of anything, it has to be such that it couldn't be otherwise. Right, so for something to be necessary, right, so let's say if X is necessary, then X could not be otherwise. What does that mean? What does it mean for something to not be able to be otherwise? Well, consider certain kinds of claims, right? So let's say we have the claim that mammals are warm-blooded. This is exactly the kind of claim Aristotle would have been interested in. What Aristotle would say is if you can come to have scientific knowledge of this, if you can come to have understanding, if you can come to have episteme of it, then that means that not only is this claim true, and obviously the conclusion of a demonstration has to be true, it's a deductive argument from true premises, so its conclusion has to be true. Or it's a deductively valid argument from true premises, so its conclusion has to be true. It's not just that it's true. It's that it's true and it's impossible for it to be false. Right? There is no way things could be otherwise, means there's no way mammals could be anything but warm-blooded. So this is a claim that's true and couldn't possibly be false. Never was false, never will be false, couldn't be false. Now I want to point something out here, which is that Aristotle, and it's not clear from the text, this is me adding a little context, Aristotle seemed to think that something being necessarily true was the same thing as it being always true. And that's not right. That's just a mistake. There's a difference between couldn't be otherwise and never has been, isn't and never will be otherwise. All right, as an example, take the fact that Elizabeth I, Elizabeth the Great of England, Queen of England in the 1600s, never had, well, 1500s and 1600s, never had any children. We assume this is true. Maybe it's not true, but just assume that what most historians think is true. She never had any children. Well, given that she's now dead, she's never going to have any children. Right? So if she didn't have any children in the past, and if it's too late for her to have children now, then obviously it's always been true, always will be true, that Elizabeth I didn't have any kids. If you think, right, so let's write down the claim of Aristotle's that I'm giving you an example to reject. If you think that necessarily true is the same thing as always true, then you'd have to say that the claim that Elizabeth I is childless is necessarily true, meaning it could not have been otherwise, but obviously it could have. Right? She could have had children. In case you don't know any of the backstory here, Elizabeth I never married. She never married because she was queen. If she married somebody, he'd become king, and part of her power would go away. So her not marrying was a choice. And in the situation in England at the time, for her to have a child outside of marriage was not really an option. So this was not something where there was some biological reason she couldn't have a child. This was a matter of statecraft. She chose to remain single so that she could have all the power of the monarch to herself, and that meant that she couldn't have children. Okay. Given that that's the reason why she couldn't have children, it seems like she very easily could have. If she had liked political power less, right? Maybe she would have decided, yeah, I'll get married, have kids. Right? Who knows? Plenty of people make this decision, but we ordinarily think anyway, the fact that it was a decision meant that they could have gone the other way with it. They could have decided to do a different thing. Seems like Elizabeth I could have decided to get married and have kids. And so, while it's always true that Elizabeth I is childless, it's nonetheless not necessarily true. So this equation that Aristotle seems to have in mind is false. And the reason why I point this out is that Aristotle seems to be making a more general error or potential error, or he's making a more general claim that goes along with this necessarily true equals always true thing that also might be fishy. And it's that Aristotle thinks universal claims or universal truths and necessary truths are the same thing. Or rather, that anything that's a universal truth is a necessary truth. This would make sense of why he thinks that demonstrations can only be of necessary truths and can only come from necessary truths. Or rather, it makes sense of why the ultimate premises of demonstrations have to be necessary truths. Because the ultimate premises of demonstrations are going to all be universal claims. That little comment Aristotle has about the difference between something being better known by us and better known by nature. He says that particular claims are better known by us, but universal claims are better known by nature. And it's better known by nature or universal claims that serve as the ultimate foundations for demonstration. So to go back to the foundationalism thing from chapter 3, right, there are some claims from which you can derive truths, but which themselves were not derived from anything else. So they can be used as premises in demonstration, but they were not themselves demonstrated. Those fundamental foundational claims, those are all going to be universal claims, Aristotle thinks. And he does seem to think that universal truths are going to be necessary truths. And that goes along with this idea that necessary truths and truths that are always true seem to Aristotle to be the same thing. Universal truths will be true across all time and space, everywhere and every time. And so there seems to be this kind of equation here. And I just want to express a little skepticism. It seems like there's a difference between something that always is true and something that has to be true. There are even potentially some things that are necessarily true but aren't always true, or at least maybe they become necessarily true once they're true. So, for example, it is you might think it's a necessary truth that human beings are descended from, let's say, primates, other primates. I mean, human beings are a primate, but human beings are descended from primates, right? That we evolved from primates. That might be a necessary truth insofar as that's part of how biologists define different species is by their spot in the evolutionary tree. And so it's just part of what defines us as human beings that we have the location we do on the evolutionary tree so that we evolved from what we evolved from. It's a necessary truth that human beings evolved from other primates, meaning that when it's true, it couldn't help but be true. Right? It's not something that could have been different. It's not true that we could have evolved from lizards or something like that, or directly from lizards. How about this? It can't be true that human beings evolved from birds. There we go. But nonetheless, at one point, it wasn't true that human beings evolved from primates because there were neither primates, there were no human beings, and there weren't even any other primates. Like, go back 500 million years. You might think, well, it's not true yet. It will be true. And when it's true, it'll be necessarily true. But it hasn't been made true yet because human beings don't even exist. Now, that's a touchy subject. You might think there can be necessary truths about things that don't exist or don't exist yet. And also, this gets us into an area we're going to talk about in a future video about the idea that there are universally true, there are claims that are true about the future and whether or not they're necessarily true. That's what the reading from On Interpretation is about. But either way, I just want to express some skepticism about the seeming equation between universal truth and necessary truth, right? That Aristotle's got going. It seems like some things could be universally true, true at all times and all places, but not yet necessarily true. Okay. That said, right, all that stuff about here's some things that might be going on in Aristotle's thought that might be fishy. There is a good reason, or there have been throughout history good reasons given, not necessarily ultimately convincing reasons, but good reasons for thinking that if you give a complete scientific explanation of something, it has to be true, meaning it's necessarily true, right? So not just that the result of any demonstration is true, but that the result of any demonstration is necessarily true. Now, why is that? Well, let's think about what an explanation involves, right? So let's say you ask for an explanation of something. Suppose you're interested in why some bridge collapsed. Right? So, there's a bridge collapse and NTSB goes out to investigate like what the hell happened, and they want explanations. They talk to the engineers who built the bridge. They talk to the people who, like the geologists familiar with the land into which the bridge supports were placed. They talk to people who keep records on the weather, people who keep records on the maintenance of the bridge. They talk to all these people and they try and get an explanation. And suppose they get an explanation, right? Suppose they come back and they say, the bridge collapsed because inferior materials were used to build it. All right, so let's say they go in front of Congress, right? Because let's say this was an interstate and Congress wants to know why did this section of the interstate fall? And they're sitting there in committee and the senators are asking questions, and one of the scientists from the NTSB says the reason this bridge collapsed is because inferior materials were used to build it. And some senator wanting to grandstand and make a point says, so you're saying that once the engineers decided to use these inferior materials, this bridge was inevitably going to fall. And then suppose the guys from the NTSB are like, oh no, not inevitably. It could have easily stayed up for hundreds of years. You might be like, oh, well, then how's it true that it fell because the inferior materials were used? Right? How could it be true that that's the explanation if, given that inferior materials were used, the bridge could have just as well stayed up? Right? You might be tempted to say, well, then the inferior materials can't be the whole story. There has to be something else. Like maybe it's the inferior materials plus the weather. Like maybe they used a kind of stone that swells or like that kind of swells in hot weather, and that caused buckling in the bridge, right? And shrinks in cold weather, and this causes the bridge to buckle. So it's the combination, you might say, of the inferior materials plus the weather patterns, or the climate, let's say. If you're tempted to make that move, to say, well, if it's true that using the inferior materials by itself wouldn't lead the bridge to collapse, then that can't be the whole explanation, so we need more. What you're doing there is expressing the idea that if X explains Y, right? So if X explains Y, then X should be sufficient for Y. It's a very normal way to think about explanation. That when you find the explanation for why something happened or why something's true, the thing doing the explaining, the thing you cite as the explanation, ought to be sufficient for Y, right? It ought to be the case that if X is in place, if X is true, if X obtains, then Y is going to happen or become true or something like that. Another way of putting that, and this is a little bit confusing given the stuff I told you before about necessary and sufficient conditions, is that if x is sufficient for y, then x necessitates y. Given x, y necessarily happens. And this suggests that what we're doing when we explain something is we're showing what made the thing being explained to happen. We're showing what made the bridge collapse. That given the explanation, the bridge just had to collapse. And this does suggest that if you give an explanation of something, then that thing is necessary given the explanation. Right? Now, that doesn't yet get us to the claim that Aristotle was making, which is that they're just necessary. And to explain the difference, right? Let's suppose we have a bomb, right? So we'll draw it in red because it's a bomb. It's dynamite, right? So here, I'll draw some dynamite. This is a mistake. I shouldn't be drawing dynamite. Not because there's anything wrong with drawing dynamite, but because like I'm bad at it. Right? So there, even though I just said it was a mistake, I'm still doing it. So there's the dynamite. And let's say the dynamite or the fuse for the dynamite is hooked up to a computer that has a random number generator. Right? So we've got a computer here. I don't know why this computer hooked up to a bomb would have a keyboard and a monitor, but I don't really know what else to draw for a computer. You might wonder why I'm drawing it, given that I'm doing such a bad job of drawing, but whatever. Also, this computer looks like it's from around 1985. Bear with me on that. Let's say there's a wireless connection from the computer to the fuse for the dynamite. And if the random number generator from the computer lands on an even number, the dynamite will explode, and if it lands on a odd number, the bomb won't explode. What that means is an even number coming from the computer is sufficient for the bomb exploding. It means that an even number coming from the computer is necessary, or necessitates the bomb exploding. Another way of putting that is the bomb exploding is necessary given an even number. But that doesn't mean the bomb exploding is necessary. Because if it's a random number generator, it could also have landed on an odd number. And if you have any worries about, well, no, random number generators aren't really random, make this a quantum computer. Go into the future. Somebody has created a quantum computer that does random stuff, right? Truly random stuff. Get back to quantum stuff a little bit, hopefully by the end of this video. Truly random stuff hooked up to the bomb. Right? The bomb exploding would be necessary given an even number coming from the computer, but it wouldn't be necessary. It wouldn't be necessarily true. It's something that could fail to happen. So just because an explanation necessitates the thing it explains, if you think that, and I'll give a little reason to doubt that hopefully by the end of this video, just because that's true doesn't mean that everything that's explained is necessary. Unless you think that if you explain y with x, right? So let's go back to here. If you've explained y using x, right, you now know that y is necessary given x. But suppose you think further that everything has an explanation. Well, that means x needs an explanation. And so let's say x gets explained by w. That would now mean that x is necessary given w, right, on this supposition about what explanation involves. And also that y was necessary given w. But now w needs to be explained. Let's say w is explained by v, and you can probably already see what's happening here. This combination of the claim that everything has an explanation, or just this claim that everything has an explanation, looks like it's going to generate an infinite regress, the same kind of regress we saw in the argument from chapter 3. Now, and just like in chapter 3, we can have different responses to this regress. One response would be to just say, yeah, there's an infinite number of things, right? Going back in time, right? if you on the assumption that X explaining Y means X happens before Y. That's not always true. There's some kinds of explanation that don't imply that one thing happens prior to another, but more straightforward kind of explanation, right? The kind involved in my bridge collapsing example. Right? The inferior materials were put into the bridge before the bridge collapsed. So following that kind of straightforward example, you could have an explanation which says there's an infinite number of explanations in the chain going back on forever. If you take that route, right, if you decide to go that way, then it seems like you can avoid Aristotle's claim that anything that's fully scientifically explained will be necessary. It'll just be necessary given what came before, but nothing will be ever totally necessary, right? Just necessary, full stop. It'll be necessary given, so Y will be necessary given X, X will be necessary given W, W will be necessary given V, and so on and so forth all the way back. But let's say you're like Aristotle and you're like, it can't go on forever, right? The chain can't go backwards for an infinite length of time or an infinite number of members. So it has to stop, right? One thing you could do is make it a circle, right? That was another option that Aristotle explored and rejected when it came to the regress argument in chapter 3. And that would be to say that maybe eventually with some things along the way, Y necessitates V. V necessitates W, W necessitates X, X necessitates Y. That's odd. That's an odd thing to think. Circular explanations seem, if anything, worse than circular justifications or circular demonstrations. So let's say you didn't like the circularity. Well, that suggests, if you don't like infinity, or an infinity of members in the explanation, and if you don't like circularity in the explanation, seems like there has to be an earliest term in this explanation. Let's say it's V. Well, how does that fit with everything has an explanation? Well, you could say V explains itself. V is self-explanatory. Right? Or another way of putting it is V requires no explanation. Those are different views. One view says everything does have an explanation because some things explain themselves. The other one would be to say everything has, or not everything has an explanation. There are some things that don't require an explanation. Different ways of taking that. We're not going to explore that in this video. But either way, no matter what you do there, it seems like you're stuck saying that V is necessary, especially if V explains itself. If V is self-explanatory, you don't need anything to tell you why V is true. And normally when we are looking for explanations, we're looking for why something happened rather than not. So like, if you go back to the bridge example, the bridge fell down. Why did the bridge fall down rather than stay up? That's what we want to know. There's a contrast there because we can sort of think that both things are possible. We want to know why it turned out that of the two things that seemed possible, only one of them happened. Well, one reason why you either wouldn't need an explanation for V or why V would be self-explanatory is if there just are no alternatives to V. Some things seem like they might just be true, and you can't imagine any other way for things to be, so there's nothing really to explain. So for example, let's say 1 + 1 = 2. That's true. Do you need an explanation of why it's true? I mean, I don't personally, because it seems to me like, well, what's the alternative? 1 + 1 = 3? Right? How could that be true? I can't even imagine what that would be, what it would take for that to be true. I don't need an explanation because there doesn't seem to be any alternative. I don't need to be told why one thing is true rather than another. So if you take this route, if you say that there's an ultimate end to explanation, it seems like the earliest thing in the explanation is going to have to be necessary. Otherwise, it would need to be explained. Right? And to get a little more terminology on the table here, the contrast with necessity or a necessary truth is a contingent truth. A contingent truth is something that is true, but it could have been false. So something that's contingent could be otherwise. What I'm basically saying here is if there's an earliest term in the explanation, it seems like it can't be contingent. Otherwise, it would need an explanation. So what you could do is say, well, maybe not everything has an explanation, but say rather that, and here I'll write it down as an alternate principle. Every contingent thing has an explanation. Or every seemingly contingent thing, everything where you can imagine it being false, right? Where you can conceive of it being false has an explanation. If this is all right, then it suggests that the earliest term in the explanation has to be necessary, right? So that, let's say V is true and it has to be true. You know that because V explains W, that W has to be true if V is true. But if V has to be true, then that means W has to be true. And then X has to be true. And then Y has to be true. And this suggests that anytime you give a full explanation of anything, you're showing why it's necessarily true. You're showing that its occurrence can be explained by some long train of explanation all the way back to some fundamental truth that couldn't possibly be false. And I do think this is what Aristotle thinks. I don't think he's getting at it in the clearest way. I think this, what I think of as a fairly good argument, don't know if it's true, but a fairly good argument, gets mixed up with these things like universal truths are the same thing as necessary truths. Something being always true is the same as it being necessarily true. I said, nah, not really good reason to think that. But it does seem like there is an interesting argument here. If explanations necessitate, right? So if an explanation necessitates what it explains, and if everything needs an explanation unless it's necessary, then it seems like everything's necessary, right? Because everything gets an explanation and everything gets explained from fundamental truths. And so everything that happens has to happen because there's an explanation of why it happened. And given the explanation, it had to happen. But the thing that serves as the explanation, it too needs to be explained. And whatever explains it will have forced that thing to be true. So you've got an explanation for why, right? Once you have an explanation for why, it might seem like that means that given X, Y had to happen. There was no other way it could turn out. But then X has to be explained. So X had to be true. There was no other way for it to turn out. X might have seemed contingent, but it wasn't. To go back to the bridge example, if you get a full explanation, like it's inferior materials plus the climate together meant that the bridge was necessarily going to collapse. If that's true, well, then we need an explanation for why the climate is the way it is. We need an explanation for why inferior materials were used. And so it'll turn out the use of the inferior materials will be necessary, right? And that seems troublesome. What Aristotle is getting to here, and he's not going to deal with the consequences of this thought in this book, and we're not going to explore Aristotle's response to this problem, but he has seemed to have gotten to the idea of something called determinism, something we're going to spend a lot on, or something we're going to spend a lot of time on when it comes to later figures, Descartes and Hume. Determinism is just the view that given the way the past was, the present and the future are set. Right? There's only one way things could turn out, given what was true in the past. So given the stuff that explains why the world is the way it is now, that means the world has to be the way it is now. And this really does follow from the idea that everything has an explanation and explanations necessitate. And you might already be able to tell, like, wait, doesn't this look like it poses problems for the way we ordinarily think of ourselves? Like, today I decided to wait till apparently after midnight to start this video. Well, that was my decision. I decided to do other things earlier in the day. It's a Sunday. I was taking a little time off, right? But if there's an explanation for that decision, which one of those principles there, everything has an explanation, or every contingent thing has an explanation, well, then there's an explanation. There has to be an explanation for it. And if there's an explanation for it, then I had to decide that way, given the explanation. But the explanation in turn needs to be explained, and so on and so forth, until it turns out that every decision I made had to happen that way. It follows from some fundamental truth about the universe that can't be changed, which means none of my decisions could be changed, even by me, like even before I made them. This is the problem of free will. Aristotle was the first to get in the neighborhood of this problem. It's one of the few things where Plato didn't come up with the position first. Like even the regress argument we covered last time, Plato basically came up with that before Aristotle did. There's lots of stuff where like Plato just got there first before anybody else. Most of the problems in philosophy Plato came up with. But this is one, and this is a big one, where it seems like Aristotle came up with it first. And we're going to be dealing with it in some way for the rest of the course once we're done with Aristotle. All right, I said I wanted to get to quantum mechanics briefly. I got 4 minutes before this turns into a half-hour-long video. Whoops. So now you know what I look like at YouTube if you slow this video down. I brought up quantum mechanics before because I brought up a quantum computer. Quantum computer is one that, well, I'm not going to pretend to understand what a quantum computer is, but it makes use of quantum phenomena in order to go much faster because it can be in multiple states at once. I don't really understand that, but here's something I do understand about quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, if you're not aware, is the study of the behavior, the motion of incredibly small things. Quantum comes from quanta, which was supposed to be the smallest possible like packet of energy. It was introduced to explain why radioactive materials didn't seem to release energy in like a constant way. It released it in bursts. So they said, oh, there's like some smallest amount of energy when an electron jumps from one shell to another shell, and that's what's being released by this radioactive material, whatever. Well, it's not radioactive. I fudged a few details there. Don't worry about it. The point is that there is this study of the very smallest of things, electrons and smaller, right? Maybe not smaller than electrons, but fundamental particles like electrons, smaller than even protons and neutrons in a lot of cases. And here's the thing. There's a lot of weird stuff going on with quantum mechanics. And the most popular interpretation, the most popular understanding of quantum mechanics, like all physicists agree about what happens at the quantum level. They all agree about the mathematics that describe what happens at the quantum level, but they don't agree fully on like what's fundamentally going on. They don't agree about what explains why tiny objects do the things they do. And some of the things they do appear to be completely random. And the dominant interpretation, it's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, says, yeah, they're just random. When you get to really small things, you can't say for sure what's going to happen. What this means is when we explain quantum phenomena, when we explain why atoms do what they do, why the subatomic particles within atoms do what they do, the most we can get is that given A, where A is some quantum state, we can predict that B will happen with a 99.999, I'm not going to be able to write enough nines, so I'll just do ... there, percent chance, but not 100, never 100. Well, what that means is the best explanation you could give of B would be A. But A doesn't necessitate B. A just makes B very, very likely. If that's true, then maybe it's not correct to say that explanations necessitate. Maybe it's only correct to say that explanations make what they explain very, very likely, which would undermine everything I just said. Now, I said that that was the dominant interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's not the only one. There are lots of other interpretations of quantum mechanics where there's no randomness. But it's just something to be aware of, right? Common sense understandings of explanation seem to support this idea that everything that gets explained is necessary given the explanation. And then this, basically another version of the regress argument seems to suggest that means that everything is necessary. Nothing could be different than it actually was. But there is some reason to doubt that the common sense notion of explanation is correct. All right, this has mostly not been about Aristotle, but it's been defending a view that Aristotle holds, which is that when you have a full explanation of something, you've shown why it has to be true. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means, what that implies in subsequent videos.